Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining this session, Managing Regulatory Investment and Litigation Risk through Understanding Toxicological Impacts and Effective Strategic Communication. I am Justin Jameson from Wolf Container Chemical and a committee member for the Pittsburgh Chemical Day. I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Oliver Schmidt and Dr. Frank Mink from the Center for Communication Strategies, or C4CS. Oliver has over 25 years of experience consulting CEO and boards of directors in strategic communications, crisis management, and organizational leadership. He also teaches courses on crisis communication, management, and harnessing the power of social media in a crisis. Frank Mink is a former EPA director who has been a causation expert on over 100 tort or liability cases. He has received awards from both the DEA and the DOJ for excellence and consults with over 100 Fortune 500 companies. This session will be recorded and available right here on the WOVA website, exactly where you're viewing the live stream, within each session for up to 6 months after the event. Any related documents can be found below within the session as well. We'd love to hear from all of you. Please utilize the Q&A session to the right to ask any questions. Austin will be consolidating the questions and posting them to the presenter at the end of the session. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Oliver and Frank.
Thank you very much, Justin. Frank and I are very glad to speak today, present to Pittsburgh Chemical Day participants. This is our first time presenting. We've previously been in touch and have presented as part of the Chemical Association of Pittsburgh and other players within the industry. We officially welcome you to today's session and would like to go through just a couple of things here. As far as logistics timing is concerned, we're going to be talking for about 50 minutes or so. That leads us to the lunch break today. And we have planned the Q&A toward the end of our session. So we'll be presenting and then invite everyone to ask questions, or you can do so during the session using the chat function, which we will get to as part of the Q&A. Real brief, C4CS goes back to the 1990s. We have from day one specialized in strategic communication and crisis management. I'm one of 3 founders of the company. We got started in Charlotte, North Carolina, have an international footprint now with representation in the US and in Europe. And today I have my colleague, Dr. Frank Mink, with us. He is very senior in terms of his toxicology expertise, having worked in, as you said earlier, Justin, in different settings, including EPA, private industry. Very glad to have him with us at C4CS. And without any further ado, I want to lead us over to the agenda we have for today. Frank is actually going to come on and discuss risk assessment and risk management, which are parts 2 and 3 of today's presentation. I will be covering the fundamentals, which will start in just a little bit. And then I will come on again following Frank for risk and crisis communication. And then Frank and I are going to talk about what you need, which is sort of some summary of what we're covering. And finally, the Q&A, as mentioned earlier. This is under the moniker of risk and crisis management. So every single one of our slides is going to show at the top risk management and crisis management. And I'm now starting with the section called fundamentals. First off, we work a lot with senior management teams, boards of directors, a lot of direct contact with CEOs of companies. And I mentioned it earlier, we go back to the 1990s. When we got started, we actually had probably about half of the companies that we started out with were chemical companies. So from a Celanese acetate to, well, the whole 9 yards. And so chemical has always been at the forefront of our manufacturing practice, if you will. And when we talk to senior leaders and boards, we often find that risk and crisis are not very well defined within the corporations. And even if it's written down somewhere, there is a plan in existence, then oftentimes senior management doesn't really know what a given definition looks like. And when they talk to us about risk, the concept can be a little hard for us to understand and vice versa. So to get that out of the way and sort of have a workable foundation, we thought we would include a definition for risk and hazards. This is the one for risk. It actually means the probability or chance that a given hazard posed by, for instance, a toxic chemical will have adverse effects, and that could be, for instance, environmental contamination or negative health effects for people who are exposed to whatever hazardous material we might be looking at. And for us, it's very important to get across that there are multiple views of risk. It's very, very important to understand that stakeholders will sometimes fundamentally differ in terms of how they perceive risk, how they react to a given risk. And understanding that difference is essential in terms of being on the forefront of putting in the appropriate response to whatever risk you might be dealing with. In addition to risk, I said it earlier, we want to define hazard for everyone. And hazard means the potential to cause harm, and that could include injury or even death and so forth. Now, again, hazard is often confused with risk, even though risk is merely the probability or chance that a specific hazard will have adverse effects. And the example on the slide here is sulfuric acid, which, for example, is obviously a hazardous chemical, hazardous material. But if it's handled the way it's supposed to be handled, the risk is actually very small. And that's where the difference between the view on a given risk between stakeholders, for instance, people who live close to a plant that handles this and other hazardous materials, and how management might view a given risk is important. This is also discussed in the following cartoon. We're looking at Dilbert here. Our town hasn't had a murder since 1957, and there are two ways that can be interpreted. Oftentimes, unfortunately, we run into management teams that say, we have a great risk mitigation strategy in place. We have our organizational readiness for whatever event might occur all lined up. And in fact, we're not going to experience any problems because we have a fantastic track record. We haven't had any problems in more than 10 years, you name it. And statistically speaking, and looking at the organizational life cycle of including chemical companies, having had a good stretch of 10 years or more doesn't really mean much. It could, in fact, mean that you're now more likely, because people are sort of getting a little more laissez-faire in terms of how they see things based on that positive track record, and something might very well happen in another week, month, name it. So the definition of an optimist is what we often run into. And while we do not play the pessimist in those kinds of situations, we certainly do want to remind management teams, senior leaders, that there is another side to this. And I'm not even using the term pessimist in these kinds of situations, but it's important to understand that, again, according to the organizational life cycle, you are at any given point in time, almost no matter how much preparation you have, how much readiness planning you're doing, at least a small chance that something will go wrong. Very quickly, how about a natural disaster? You will not be able to prevent a severe hurricane, subsequent flooding, and so forth from happening. What you can do is you can prepare accordingly by understanding that risk exists. It can develop into a crisis, and now you want to get your organization ready to mount the appropriate and effective response. In terms of the risk management cycle, we wanted to introduce you to the following 5 steps. Identification of hazard and associated risks, always at the beginning of this cycle, followed by a risk assessment, which will always include the developing an understanding of impact, probability, if possible, quantification, and understanding the scope of a given event. And then you will go into a risk-benefit analysis, if that is applicable, and Frank is going to speak to that more a little bit later. And obviously, we're then mitigating risk. We're mitigating risk, which is essentially the crisis prevention phase. I'm going to talk about the crisis management cycle here in a minute. Understanding that risk management and crisis management are actually closely related is fundamental to anything that we do within the area of organizational readiness and risk management, crisis management. The last step within the cycle, as you can see on the slide, is obviously evaluation. That is doing the course of mitigating risk as well as following a complete risk management cycle. And then you need to learn as an organization, which oftentimes will include pretty significant organizational change, especially if you're coming out of an actual crisis that resulted from a risk developing into a severe situation. I just mentioned the correlation between risk management and crisis management, and we do want to introduce you to the crisis management cycle. There are three phases that we in the crisis management, risk management industry talk about. The pre-crisis phase, that consists of anticipation, prevention, and preparation. And we have the actual crisis response phase, during which we attempt to contain and control. And we have the post-crisis phase, which will segue right into the pre-crisis phase. During the post-crisis phase, we will first attempt to recover as best as possible, and then go into the evaluation, learning, and change mode. Again, we're talking about organizational change as well as individuals who are in decision-making roles, learning new things, acquiring new skills in order to be in a better position to respond to a given risk that then potentially develops into a crisis in the future. This process will not work seamlessly unless, as an organization, we have an effective response and planning in place, which will always rely heavily on collaboration. Collaboration is critical, as it says here. And this speaks to the fact that we have three distinct areas: a managerial response, an operational response, and a communication response, which have to be aligned. If they are not, then the crisis management, once a risk goes south and develops into a crisis, will not work. So the managerial response, what do we mean by that? That stands for any decision-making in conjunction with responding to a given crisis. Obviously, decision-making alone doesn't do anything unless you put in the appropriate mitigation efforts. You want to contain and control, you do so by mounting activities as part of your response, which would be covered under operational response. And then thirdly, you have the communication response, which not only connects the managerial response and the operational response, which would be on the internal end, but you also have communication between the organization and external parties, external stakeholders. And all of this, and this is why we are mentioning online as a separate area under communication response, has since the arrival of social media dramatically changed. Therefore, you need to keep an eye on social media in order to be in touch with both internal and external audiences and stakeholders via social media. There's going to be a little more information later today as part of our presentation. In addition to collaborating and then collaboration being critical from a managerial, operation, and communication viewpoint, you also obviously need to collaborate across functional areas within your organization. And here's an example of a response team that applies to both how you may want to manage risk as well as how you will have to manage your crisis response should something happen. And this is just an example. Specific industries may have a different composition of their response teams, obviously, where other areas that are not even included on this chart will be included instead of, for instance, research and development, or you name it. However, for chemical companies, obviously important to have health, safety, environment mentioned here. And then in the lower right, you have other topical experts. C4CS functions as an auxiliary member to a number of crisis response teams where we're on standby and included in any notification effort and response effort And there are obviously many others, whether that's external legal counsel or folks that help with picking up on any environmental contamination and control and so forth. You will need to have primary, backup, and auxiliary response team members. Very important to understand that backup is key here. If you have only one person designated and that person happens to be out sick or on vacation, traveling to a faraway location, then you will have a response that will lack. So we always emphasize that having backups is certainly very important. I already said that the members of response teams represent the relevant business functions, and that is company specific, first of all, industry specific, and then definitely company specific. And you should have these teams in place for any risk mitigation, for any response to any crisis events at the local, regional level, national level. And if you are global, then you obviously would have that at the global headquarters level. I mentioned earlier that we are dealing with different views on risk, and very importantly, management's view is technical and analytical. When we work with senior management teams, also board members, what typically is raised is concerns regarding magnitude, probability. We're talking about known facts, understood consequences, and liability obviously plays a role. But how about, and this is very important to understand, emotions and perceptions, because emotions and perceptions enter the picture once you talk about external stakeholders. And those external stakeholders see the risk potential, see crisis-related impacts very different, very different. They may think that something is impossible while you think it's certainly possible. They may get very angry over something that affects them directly from an emotional standpoint, while you might say, well, gee, let's look at the numbers. It's not even that bad. And that's what this slide speaks to. The stakeholder view is described as affective or emotional. And the emotional view is very different from the analytic view that we discussed earlier under management view. In this view, the emotional view is shaped by stakeholder perception, influenced by stakeholder outreach, and it's based upon personal experience and impact. So if I have my family suffering because groundwater is being contaminated, as we understand, by a chemical company, by a chemical plant that is not far from where my family lives, then obviously I will have a very different opinion than maybe some of the management team might have in terms of the magnitude of the problem. And it may only be, in an extreme case, just my family. It's a rural area, and I own a lot of land around the plant. It's just my family that's directly impacted. But certainly, as a result of being impacted personally, I will see this as a grave threat to the health and well-being of my loved ones and myself. So, not fair. Companies cast as the villain in these types of scenarios. Those are all things that we're very familiar with. And I will now hand it over to Frank, who's going to talk about, this is the agenda slide, first risk assessment and then crisis management. Frank, please.
Well, I'll try my best to make a somewhat boring subject interesting, and I'm going to do that through an example. But I'd first like to define toxicology, and that's really the study of poisons. And poisons are the adverse effects of substances on living systems. I always like to add the old adage that all toxicologists know, and that's all substances are poisons. There's none which is not a poison. The right dose differentiates a poison from a remedy. And when you say that, some people say, well, that's overly broad, but it's not. Oxygen, if there's too much or there's too little, or it's administered in the wrong route, it can be extremely, cause extreme adverse effects, including death. Same with water, too little, too much, or administered in the wrong route of exposure can cause serious consequences. So chemical toxicology is the potential adverse effects and controls of chemical in the workplace. And that also includes the workplace outside the building, the site, so to speak, whether it be a landfill or an operating facility or whatever. And that's what I've dealt with most of my career. what is the dose? And as Oliver said, really perception, Dr. Phil summarized what he said, in that perception is reality, and perception usually precedes reality in toxicology. Many times there's a perception of something being bad when the reality may or may not support that. Next slide, Oliver. I'm going to use an example of something I worked on many years, of diacetyl, which is a chemical that was produced and used mostly in food and flavoring products. And back in 1985, there was an international baker's site that had some issues and had a very rare lung disease called bronchiolitis obliterans, unfortunately shortened to BO, different obviously from body odor. But it was a very rare and a very severe disease. And so NIOSH went in and took a look at the plant and said, you know, we think this is caused, the primary issue we see here is certain dust, which were known to cause lung irritation and scarring that would produce this rare disease, bronchiolitis obliterans. When we started taking a look at this, which we didn't start taking a look till there was an issue in 2000 and 2001 in a plant in Missouri, a flavoring plant, and I came in and did some studies, and they looked and initially said, yeah, we believe this is the dust, just like in 85. And we found out that they all of a sudden went on a different track without any warning, without any documentation, that there was this chemical diacetyl, because there was quite a bit in the plant, quite a bit being in relation to other substances that were known not to cause BO, and little was known about it. And so they started to investigate this and did a large investigation. What we found, we started to look at it, and unfortunately, we started looking at it late, 17 years after the initial cases, and that happens frequently in industry. You have to be careful. When there's smoke, it's easy to put out the fire. When there's a 5-alarm fire, it becomes very difficult to overcome perception with reality. One of the first realities we saw was diacetyl. The average smoker consumed about 100 times as much diacetyl as the maximum found in these plants. That's a startling fact when you consider that not a single cigarette smoker in the history of modern research and medical records has ever developed bronchiolitis obliterans. That, in our book, is not chance. That is a statistical fact. Next slide, Oliver. That led us to the concern that diacetyl may not be a problem. But after several years, in 2011, NIOSH decided they would put out a recommended exposure level. Now, that's not a regulatory level, that's an advisory level. And then it's reviewed by OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they can put some teeth into that with a regulatory level that's mandated through a PEL, permissible exposure level in the workplace. To date, and that's been 9 years ago, OSHA has not developed a PEL, and it still remains just a recommended exposure level from NIOSH. If you go to the next slide, Oliver. So they do something called a time-weighted average in workplaces, and diacetyl, you could actually have an exposure. People don't understand the time-weighted average over your 8-hour shift, that maybe you have 10 parts per billion between 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. You have no exposure between 11 and 3, and then you have 1 part per billion between 3 and 4. So at the end of your shift, you have 3.9 parts per billion of a time-weighted average, and that's what you're looking at, because it's the average concentration you're exposed to long-term, not the maximum. And that's important to know, because people say, well, maybe the standard is not that bad. Next slide, Oliver. And also, we determine excess risk, not background risk. You have to have risk above background. Diacetyl is really present in many foodstuffs, from butter to coffee to wine to yogurt. So it's very ubiquitous. And anytime you have a ubiquitous compound, you have to be careful to see what contributions you may have to disease. And you also have to see if the disease can possibly be as a result from exposure to that particular chemical. That's part of your risk assessment. Next slide, Oliver. And there's factors such as temperature, pressure, relative humidity, affects the volatility, as well as being in a mixture. Very few times in workplaces or in environments outside the workplace, such as landfills, we usually have a lot of different factors you have to look at that determines how volatile this compound may be. In this case, it's an air contaminant, so that's important to determining dose. Next slide, Oliver. Thank you. Same way with the boiling point. We had testimony in court, which I found was really interesting. One of the experts said that diacetyl boils at 89 degrees Fahrenheit, or 89 degrees. And they said that's a hot summer day in Missouri where the court was taking place. What he didn't mention was that was centigrade, which is 190 degrees Fahrenheit. The earth, very few places on earth have ever exceeded 190 degrees. So, but the perception became reality for that particular jury. Next slide, please. So it's important that you're careful in your assessment. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we manage these risks that we start to assess and determine a dose and an exposure from. Next slide, Oliver. People would say, wow, there's, diacetyls, even though it's in food, it's like paint stripper. It's like MEK or methyl ethyl ketone. And that's a little deceptive. And again, it's trying to create a perception that's not a reality. Water is only one functional group off of hydrogen peroxide. And if you've ever used hydrogen peroxide for any reason, very different chemical than water. You don't want to drink a lot of it, whereas water is somewhat necessary. Next slide, Oliver. When we look at causation of something, does it cause a disease? We go through an extensive process called the Bradford-Hill criteria that was developed back in the 60s for determining if smoking was a cause of serious health effects. And you go through this list of things, your dose response, your specificity, your strength of association between your statistical correlation of dose and effect. Is it possible within current biological knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. But you need to go through these kinds of exercises to determine if you really truly have something that's causative or you're attributing that cause to the wrong chemical. Next slide, Oliver. What we found when we took a look at the NIOSH study back from 2000 was they used a method that they themselves discontinued using because it was unreliable. It didn't pass the government's test for reliability. It had more than a 25% error rate. And yet they used it for all their future regulatory levels. And this is not a criticism of NIOSH per se. Every regulatory agency at times is driven by factors that are not necessarily purely scientific or technical. And sometimes they get so invested in that they continue a set of error. But if you have garbage into a model, you're going to get garbage out. And that's exactly what happened in this case. They had a tremendous number of QA/QC errors. They didn't have any reliable pre-employment testing of lung function. They just had a series of errors that added up to causing it to be a very poor study. Next slide, Oliver. And they had sampling errors, as I said, that invalidated the results. They had the wrong filter materials. They had a huge number of air sampling hits for different chemicals. There were over 100 chemicals. In some of the plants, there were over 1,000 chemicals. And many of them were known to cause the rare disease, and diacetyl was not, but they concentrated on diacetyl because the momentum of the regulatory process overtook the technical accuracy. Next slide, please. They didn't rule out other chemicals and non-occupational or pre-employment exposures. And this is important, really important for manufacturing facilities and chemical facilities, in that people have lives and they're exposed to different things. And there's voluntary risk and non-voluntary risk. If I go out and decide that I want to race cars or fly my own airplane, or I want to smoke cigarettes, that's voluntary risk. That's very different than involuntary risk, where I go into a job and I am exposed to something without protection that is a hazard to my health. And we usually regulate involuntary risk at a much lower level because we're not aware necessarily of those risks. Well, also, as I said earlier, you're looking at excess risk, risk beyond background risk. So next slide, Oliver. They also decided to try to determine with animal testing if these human epidemiological studies had merit. And unfortunately, we continued a series of decisions that weren't in the best technical light or made in a way that followed the evidence. And so we picked a lot of the wrong animal studies. They had different physiological effects, different airway structures. So we continued mounting error upon error. Next slide, Oliver.
All right.
So what do you take away from that? Well, it sounds like, gee, you have all this evidence and you never had a regulatory mandate from OSHA, but you have this a recommended exposure instead of a permissible exposure hanging out there. And what did that communication caused almost 20 years of litigation, over $100 million in awards against various companies, and we're no closer today to a policy that looks at the data that would change and have a reasonable look at what the true causative agent was and what we should be regulating. So what does that do? That means that whatever was present in those plants causing that issue would still be causing those issues if it wasn't for the fact that industry took the great step in increasing ventilation, using better protective or more protective respirators and rules to use those respirators. And so industry actually solved their own problem, even though the causative agent was never known. But that still didn't change the damage that occurred to the chemicals that are the companies that sold those chemicals to this day. It hurt shareholder prices for years. Investors were unhappy with the result and the continuing liability. And to this day, we still have these kind of issues. And I've dealt with things like glyphosate, the recent trials and the stock price issues, PFAS, PFAS, the firefighting foams, etc., from military to companies. And many times we have to be careful of these perceptions. We can do a good analysis, and we need to do that risk analysis early, and we need to make it as strong as possible. But we still have to manage the crisis, and we do that through the communication to the best of our ability of the facts versus the perception. And with that, I'm going back to Oliver to continue on with that.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, we did want to tell you about risk communication and crisis communication as it relates to what Frank just covered. And when we talk to senior management teams, we often hear that, well, yeah, communication is sort of a nice to have. And we have our communications people here. They do all of our marketing communications, for instance. We're just going to ask them to also handle risk communication if that's your recommendation. Well, it's not that easy. Risk communication, crisis communication are areas that require a lot more than having worked for X number of years on marketing communication or internal communication, or you name it, within that communication discipline, within that space. First off, risk communication defines interactive process of the exchange of information and opinions concerning a risk or potential risk is one of the shorter for sure definitions that we have used in the past. We came many years ago out with a definition of our own, according to which risk communication is always a proactive planning process. That's very important, proactive, in which stakeholders and their concerns or fears even regarding actual and perceived risks are systematically, very importantly, systematically identified in order to then develop and execute strategies that enable effective two-way communication about those complexities and uncertainties associated with those risks. And it's important for us to get across today as we're presenting, and we have presented on these topics around the world, literally dozens of countries, and have worked with many chemical companies in particular. We're always interested in the following tasks that need to be performed when it comes to risk communication. Nothing, and I want to repeat, nothing is ever possible unless you are seen as credible and trustworthy. As a company, if you have not built that credibility and trust, you are going to lose. Because if you walk into a crisis situation, if you have a significant risk on your hands and you're only starting to, let's say, rebuild credibility and trust on the heels of whatever event you might have experienced, and your reputation is tarnished and stakeholders by and large do not believe what you're saying, then you are not in a good position at all. And we walk into those kinds of scenarios as consultants and are usually looking into very disappointed faces when we tell them that you should really have called us a long time ago, which doesn't translate into now it's too late to do something that could help. But certainly it's much better to start thinking about these things early on in order to build over a longer period of time credibility and trust. What is that for? Well, we need to inform regarding potential risk, regarding actual risk. And in order to do so for the different stakeholder groups, it's important to have increased awareness and understanding. And if that's not in place, how are we even going to help them finally make better decisions and persuade to agree to a common ground? And finally, very importantly, ask for their cooperation and specific behavioral change, behavior that will lead us to risk resolution. And if we don't reach within this process the persuasion, then we are not successful. So it is a pretty intricate process. It is something that we are very fond of in terms of introducing early on within the process, because at the end of the day, what needs to be understood is that there are many, we call them risk issue drivers, and we have a graphic here, and we can only do so much as risk communicators if there are any number of stakeholder groups of a different opinion than our side already, because they have frankly taken over how a specific risk issue is framed, including in the media, including by unions, including by lobbyists and so forth, then we will have an even harder time convincing those whom we need to convince regarding, I said it earlier, behavioral change, attitudinal change, and lastly, behavioral change. So these risk issue drivers, that's the slide we often use. There are different trends, whether they're cultural, whether they're technological, and so forth. But at the end of the day, understand that the different stakeholders, many of which are listed here that may also very well apply to your organization, have certain potentially preconceived notions, and all of this impacts the company. And the stakeholders will inevitably have a different point of view regarding a specific risk. To the point, Frank said earlier that one very important distinction is voluntary risk and involuntary risk. You see that at the very top of this slide, the bulleted list here. If a specific risk is voluntary, it is seen by stakeholders across the board, including your own employees, as less risky as opposed to an involuntary exposure or risk in general. And we can go through the list. I want to highlight maybe a 2 or 3 additional ones. If, for instance, it's naturally occurring, it is always seen as less risky. We've worked, for instance, in our area here, naturally occurring radioactive material and other areas where you can make a point to constituents that since it's naturally occurring, it's a different animal, or whether it's created by as opposed to being created by humans. Another example, do they have individual control over a given risk or very little individual control? Lastly, maybe, is it familiar to them already or unfamiliar? If things are unfamiliar to us, if they affect potentially children heavily, statistically speaking, then we're always going to see things as more risky. So these are things that we highlight in conversation with senior management teams, highlight in conversation with research and development teams, folks that are working in corporate communications, in risk management, crisis management, and so forth. We also did want to shed some more light on crisis communication. If you actually have events that require crisis communication in addition to crisis management or in tandem with crisis management, you want to be timely, truthful, consistent, and coordinated with what it is that you're doing. And that response will always entail impact assessment, business communication objectives, stakeholder information needs, and so forth. You're looking at the list right here. What's key to this process is you have to have key messages. If you don't, then you are not on the right track. And the key messages need to speak about facts, about feelings, and actions. You will remember the stakeholders you're dealing with will have emotions. They will have perception. So it's not just necessary to talk about facts. It's also necessary, critical in fact, to talk about feelings and understand what your stakeholders' feelings are given a specific risk, given a certain crisis situation, and then talk about actions, which would be mitigation. What are you actually doing in order to contain and control the situation so that your stakeholders understand that everything is on the right track in terms of rectifying the situation? There are information needs that your stakeholders have, and I'm not going to go through the whole list here. You also have the deck available to you. But I do want to highlight the point at the bottom. What are you actually doing about it, as in right now? Obviously, also what you will do as you move forward in terms of mitigating the situation, containing, controlling the crisis. But what you do is so important to convey, and then actually following through and doing it. Very, very important. We've talked about different stakeholder groups. Do not ever forget about employees. Employee communication is critical. They function as your advocates out there. They will be your ambassadors, if you will, within a given community where your company has business. And if you do not communicate with them in an effective manner, then that is always going to backfire. The other area we want to highlight here is obviously media influence. It's very important to understand that not doing a good job in terms of traditional and social media causes a lot of problems, and how you handle this situation, how you work with traditional and social media oftentimes makes a big difference and can in fact mean the difference between success and failure. You know? Social media as a phenomenon was highlighted earlier. Very important. I want to stress the fact that there are potentially damaging consequences as a result of social media entering the stage. There are also opportunities listed at the bottom, but we certainly, with lots of clients, especially in crisis situations, are very much focused on the negative. So potentially damaging because it's uncensored information, global, immediate, automated, long-lasting, and so forth. There is a process that we have developed over the years, which is depicted here. I'm not going to go into the details because we do want to segue into the Q&A here in a minute. But I certainly wanted to put it out. So monitoring, analyzing, prioritizing, then a decision. How are we going to respond? Are we even going to respond? engaging with posters, trolls potentially, and assessing what comes out of that and then learning. That's by and large what we do for our clients. Usually we engage utilizing the same tool as is listed, and we do want to show empathy where appropriate and possible. What not to do before we get into the summary slide, I wanted to point out that unfortunately, this is still what we're walking into in terms of risk management as well as crisis management. The cartoon here, okay, people, the question is, should we deny first and then delay, or delay first and then deny? I can't hear you right now, but I hope that some of you at least will chuckle or at least smile when you see this. But again, we still, obviously not verbatim, hear things along those lines, and that concerns us. That is not a good sign. It's about transparency. It's about being open to the degree we can be, obviously adhering to any laws that are in place and so forth. But any company that has skeletons in the closet that is not forthcoming may very well down the road regret it and be on the side of someone whose business is impacted heavily to the point that maybe it is threatened in terms of its existence. We come to the what you need slide. I'm pulling this up right now. And again, this is a summary here. Risk and crisis readiness assessments are important, as well as having a risk management strategy or crisis management strategy. In this day and age, because of the importance of social media, all of our clients are encouraged to have internet and media monitoring in place. You need notification and response team activation processes in place, procedures in place, social media response strategy, very important, and effective message development and delivery when it comes to the communication side of things. And going back to the crisis management, risk management side of things, for sure, under 7 scenario-based crisis response training. And that can also be geared toward the crisis communication piece of the puzzle, obviously. When have you done the last tabletop addressing a specific risk scenario? When have you done the last semi-live drill or a live exercise involving multiple locations, multiple plants of your chemical company that does have multiple plants? So those are things that we find very important. Lastly, the Q&A. I did look at the chat box and we didn't have a lot of questions. That's why I continued to speak a little bit more about the slides that we had. Frank, here's one question. You mentioned glyphosate. Do you feel this product has a real hazard or just a lawyer's payday due to poor communication of possible hazards? Do you want to speak to that, Frank?
Sure.
Or shall I handle that?
Sure. Well, I did the original assessment at EPA review of the data for the registration many years ago, and there's been several iterations since. And obviously, it became an issue in 2015 when IARC, the International Agency for Cancer Registry, had a different statistical interpretation than the one that stood for almost 20 years. And that, as you know, led to a series of lawsuits and stock issues, et cetera, et cetera. I still believe that the original data were accurate. I believe that in the long term, that's what you'll see. The perception, the unfortunate, or depending on how you look at it, fortunate or unfortunate, location of the initial trials created a lot of bad press. So as we see it play out, I believe the facts will always, scientific facts will come to light, and I believe that the original assessments will stand. I believe it's safe when used as recommended, and that's a big caveat. It is a herbicide, so it's meant to kill plants, and it can be dangerous if it's abused, as in anything. Again, it's the dose makes the poison. But I believe if used according to directions in the correct way, the original assessments are accurate.
Yeah. And I want to add to this just a little bit, not so much regarding glyphosate like I say specifically, but we as a company obviously work very, very closely with litigators, and it's important for us to also convey that fortunately over the years, back in the 90s, that was a very, very different situation. By the way, back then, 80% of what C4CS did was after a crisis had happened, and only 20% was geared toward the pre-crisis phase and putting in the safeguards, preventing, anticipation, preparedness planning, readiness planning. That has flip-flopped. We now do 80% on the preparedness planning side, and certainly do the crisis response work in responding to specific risks and so forth. But that is a fundamental shift, and we often work in tandem with certainly in-house counsel, and then also external legal experts, and that's the whole gamut. Specific chemical materials, hazardous materials, PFAS was mentioned earlier. We've done, including in our area here, Greater Pittsburgh area, work in regards to that. It's definitely important to understand that we have to work as a team. And this goes back to the slide earlier. Collaboration is key. You have the different functional areas that are represented on response teams. And then you have external assistance provided by companies, from law firms to, at the end of the day, obviously also crisis management experts. And only if we do work collaboratively will we be able to, for instance, reduce the risk of litigation and make things safer for just any stakeholder out there, including those that may be protesting in front of our plant gate right now as a result of whatever perceived risk that may only be real to, I don't know, the tune of maybe 2% or whatever it may be, given situation. But as Frank said, and this is my concluding thought here, as Frank said earlier, and that's very important to remember, perception creates reality. And in our world today, where social media highlights these perceptions and highlight the rage, frankly, protests that are geared toward companies that have made great efforts toward reducing risks systematically, communicating about the risk, and yet they are still in a position where they have to defend themselves. The bottom line is really take this seriously and put the proper planning in place early on. Don't wait until you have something happening, until a risk goes out of hand and you are venturing into crisis territory, if you will. Those would definitely be recommendations from C4CS. And again, as a company, we've done that for many, many years. We certainly do know what we're talking about. There aren't any more questions in the chat function. If you do have questions, Frank, go ahead. Did you want to?
Oh, no, it's Austin. There
was, I'm sorry, Austin. Mm-hmm.
There was one question in the Whova app. I know you showed that slide of risks viewed by stakeholders. Is there any difference between risks viewed by stakeholders versus risks viewed by shareholders?
There can certainly be differences. Let's be clear here. As a shareholder, by and large, you're primarily interested in the economic performance of a company. Now, and then it becomes more complex. If, as a shareholder, you happen to be someone who is extremely interested in, let's just say, green issues, then of course there may be an overlap with any group out there. Lots of, whether it's a Greenpeace or you name it, that has a very specific idea in terms of how risks should be handled and may put pressure on specific companies at any given point in time. But in our experience, we have been involved in shareholder lawsuits, provided assistance. We've been involved in the preparation for annual meetings in terms of the messaging utilized in those types of situations. Usually the economic benefits and the economic benefit for that particular shareholder, whether it's an organizational shareholder or it's an individual shareholder, take center stage. You know? While other stakeholders come in, and every stakeholder group is different, come in from a very different angle and have a different perspective on things based upon their stake in the matter, right? That's where the term stakeholder comes from. What is your stake? And very clearly for the shareholder, it's primarily the monetary connection, if you will, and the interest in seeing the company strive. But one thing is very clear: as a shareholder, you are certainly very interested in seeing to it that risks are dealt with appropriately. And there's a fiduciary responsibility. Members of the board of directors are now individually liable. Sarbanes-Oxley, and we have a lot of conversations with companies about these matters. That's one big reason why members of boards of directors nowadays, and for some years, have been taken out individual policies in terms of an insurance, board of director insurance, so that their liability is kept in check, if you will, because they are now individually responsible for seeing to it that crisis management is happening according to plan, that risk management is happening according to the book. And if it doesn't, then there should be a shareholder lawsuit as a result of, again, perceived or actual negligence. So these things are rather complicated. I hope I was able to shed a little more light on that. Is there anything else, Frank, that you would like to add to that?
No, I think that's accurate, Oliver.
All right.
So there was one last question, sorry. Unfortunately, our industry has a pretty bad record right now. They say think tetraethyl lead. How do you fight against just a general stigma, even if you're not directly responsible?
Well, I'll start and let Oliver finish. Obviously the long-standing issue. I think perception's difficult to overcome once it's firmly entrenched in society, but there's always a new generation. I think you have to put the facts out there clearly, honestly, and in a way that people understand. You need to put it in context. And a lot of times that's our issue, is putting things in context. So that'd be my take on that, Oliver.
Yeah, I can only agree with you there, Frank. I said it earlier, ideally no skeletons in the closet and transparency. That's what it comes down to, right? We want to encourage and do encourage our clients to take communication seriously, to take the proper crisis management seriously, to understand that proper risk management is key to having a successful business. And that is probably even more important, let's face it, for companies in what we typically refer to as sensitive industries. And the chemical industry is right there. And a bad reputation is nothing new for the chemical industry. A couple decades ago, this is something that I discussed with senior people. What can we do to get our reputation back on track, and how can we boost it? Well, certainly if an industry has a bad reputation, then that will reflect potentially badly upon individual players that may not be even close to being a bad apple. Therefore, again, it is important to understand that communication is essential. It's the one tool that can really change attitudes, I said it earlier, and eventually behaviors. And when we are talking about reputation, it has to do precisely with that, attitudes toward a given business, toward a company. We work with companies on community advisory boards within the chemical space. We even put them together for our clients, where we go out in the community, have conversations, well, who should be on such a board? We help with invitations. We even are involved in the facilitation of meetings. So there are many different ways to have a productive exchange with external as well as internal stakeholders. Again, don't forget about your employees. But it's something that we have dealt with. That's kind of what it boils down to for many, many years working with the chemical industry, that reputations may, during any given stretch, could be a couple of years, could be bad. And there we have to work on these things. I'm going to give you another example. We have worked for many, many years with the nuclear industry. Now, that's a different industry, highly regulated, obviously. Well, what do you think happened after Fukushima, right? This is now coming up on 10 years ago. After that, the industry, and it's still suffering, and that's the same for chemical companies. If you have a specific regional event, as in a chemical accident, then that's going to reverberate for many, many years. I could give you any number of examples, but I can't be, you can't be talking about specific clients now. But we've certainly seen that if there was an adversarial event, then there were consequences for many, many years in terms of, Frank said it earlier, it's a generational thing almost. You can't just from one day to the next completely change stakeholder perception. That just doesn't work. It's a long process. And what I said earlier, for instance, a community advisory board, that's one example of a way that you can stem the tide, if you will, that you can work in a different direction and have these perceptions change over time. But be mindful that you can't disregard what other risks are out there. You have to have risk management in place. You have to have crisis management, the proper planning, the proper procedures in place, so that if something happens, you're not going to re-enter this cycle where a bad experience, bad stakeholder experience will then last for any number of years, and you will essentially be cast as the villain, as we said earlier. Yeah. We did go over in terms of the time. I think those questions were excellent. Is there another question, Austin, Justin, that you're aware of that we should tackle, Frank and I?
I do not see another question, so I think we're all good. Thank you both.
Okay.
And,
sure. Yep.
Okay.
If you allow me, Austin, I know we're already over the time, but I do believe it's the lunch break anyway. So if we still have participants on, I do want to pull up this slide, Words of Wisdom, for good reason. I mean, we've really tried to focus on the idea that preparation is key, that the readiness planning is key, and this slide sort of summarizes that in a way. It is far better to prepare and prevent than to repair and repent, because, again, as was discussed earlier, the organizational life cycle has it so that any organization out there, no matter the size, the footprint, the industry, all of these parameters are certainly important to look at when you're coming up with the customized strategy. But all organizations out there, including a C4CS, obviously, have the risk of experiencing a crisis or risks popping up that then need to be handled appropriately in order to not having that risk develop into a crisis situation, cause harm to the environment for a chemical company, or physical impacts as in health related. That's very important. So in other words, the sooner you can get started to put in place the proper procedures, the better. And for most chemical companies, that's certainly true. If you have already had everything in place for decades, well, then obviously going back and understanding where are we within the review process. When was the last time we conducted training? And that should be done on a recurring basis, obviously. When was the last time that the existing plans were reviewed, including by outside parties that can benchmark appropriately, that understand what's currently going on in the industry and where are the pressure points in terms of proper crisis management and risk management. So not just the silo thinking. We as a company have done this for so many years. We know exactly how it works. No, that's not good. You want to be at the forefront of developments out there. Right? And again, it's better to prepare and prevent than to repair and repent. And the last slide we wanted to pull up. Thank you from both of us. We appreciate the opportunity that we had here to present today. If you want to get in touch with additional questions, for instance, feel free to reach out to us via email. That probably works best given our busy schedules. Frank is actually based in the Cincinnati area. That's why his cell phone number has an area code that's different from the Pittsburgh area. C4CS has, however, the headquarters here in Pittsburgh, and feel free to reach out to us. We'll be very happy to continue any conversation, to start a conversation with folks out there in regards to what we covered today, as well as other areas of interest. Frank, anything else from you?
No, I think that wraps it up.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we look forward to interacting with anyone who has an interest as we move along. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for speaking. Have a good day.